I worked collaboratively with Mira. First, I did the cinematography for So Far From India and India Cabaret, which were some of her first documentary films. And then when it came to working on Salam Bombay, initially I was considering, and Mira was considering having me shoot it. I'm self-taught as a cinematographer. So I didn't really have training as a DP, and it didn't make sense on a first fiction film for me to be first-time DP. It made much more sense to bring in somebody that had experience. At the same time, and so really in the beginning, I was going to be just a co-producer and support the cinematography, doing second unit. And we hired an art director for Salam Bombay that was out of the industry there, who just did not get the way in which we wanted to approach the design, the art direction for the film. So I said I would step on and take that on as a responsibility too, and as a challenge, and it was a great opportunity. I got my training as a production designer. I came to it kind of cold as a rookie, but working on Salam Bombay with Mira, I knew the city of Bombay, now Mumbai, through walking its streets and through responding to it as a still photographer. It's such a remarkable city, and it was especially so at that time that we were working with street kids. And I think that the challenge there with Salam Bombay was to weave fact with fiction, to find some kind of seamlessness that could come between the two. And so that's, in a way, what prepared me for the work that I did with Mississippi Masala. It was a challenging project in terms of the breadth of the story between Africa and Mississippi and the complexity of these very deep cultures between an African Indian and a black family in Mississippi. Whatever you do, whether it's Mira or me or Ed and so on, the actors, your work is informed by your life experience. And in the case of working on cinema, it was the experiences that I had in India that really, that I brought to the language of what we could do with Mississippi Masala. I think the challenge with a film like this is for it to feel authentic. I felt like that was my job, to find locations and to make sets that felt organic to where we were and to the story that was taking shape. And I was happy to see that there was a balance or tension between, particularly in Mississippi, in the motel landscape, between a kind of tawdriness and set dressing or set kind of finish. Most of the motels that I scouted were, they were pretty down and out. They were these roadie hotels that people who were driving south from the north to have a winter vacation would stay in. And they were pretty run down and maybe cheap, and that's why these Indian motel owners were able to get them fairly cheap and make them work.
I can put as many people in this room as I want.
I was happy to see that it wasn't overdressed, that we didn't overdo it. Sometimes an interior or a place will need something added to it, to activate it, to support the narrative. And sometimes things need to be taken away. And also taking into account the larger narrative, the story. I already knew Mississippi to some degree, partly through having traveled there as a photographer, but really a lot through still photography and cinema too. My understanding of the South and, I think, sense of it comes a lot from a certain tradition of still photography, beginning with Walker Evans to Robert Frank, and then there were other more, contemporary photographers. Maudie Schuyler Clay, who I knew who had lived up in New York. She was first cousin to Bill Eggleston. I met Eggleston and saw his photographs in the early 70s. That was something to reckon with. But my understanding, and I think my sensitivity to that Delta landscape, is a lot through his photography. We hired Bernie Imes, who did this project Juke Joint, and he spent several years photographing these Delta juke joints, and they just were amazing places, very charged. And he did this very respectfully, very stepped back. And I think that led in part to us picking the dance club. The research trips came out of, I think, Mira had an understanding that looking at the landscape, that stopping and visiting Indian motel owners, doing interviews with them, getting to know them, getting some sense of what the life was like between them and the communities that they were a part of, that this would, one, inform the script as it was in development, but also help to locate where was this film going to take place. So again, this dance between reality and fiction. But the more trips that we made and the more discoveries that we made, I think it was very instrumental to the development of the story and to helping to define what the landscape for the film would be. And that was already, as a methodology, something that I was very familiar with from my own practice as a still photographer and from the work I had already done collaboratively with Mira in India, on Salam Bombay, on India Cabaret, and So Far from India. And so for me, it was serious fun. It was great. You know, people were just so open. I mean, we very rarely had the door closed. But I think being in the bowels of the Mississippi Delta with its very complex and at times, you know, obviously troubled history, but also rich cultural history with music and literature and just the humanity of it, it made sense. Luscow's was this archetypal place for the cotton growers and the white world. And so it was a kind of a ready-made, if you will, to fit into the story here. There's a certain sort of fraternal sort of thing, you know, sense of it. It's clubby. You know, you have these kind of private booths where people can just, you know, get smashed or whatever. They would take the butter pads with their knives and they would, you know, kind of shoot them up. And the ceiling, it was so disgusting, was covered with this, you know, molding butter. The tension that, you know, that I felt like it was my job to create between, say, a found location and then altering it to be able to suit the story or the scene. It's also finding a balance or tension between the beautiful and the tawdry, and even seeing the beauty within the tawdry. So it was a kind of institution. And that, I think, was also maybe part of what convinced us, yes, Greenwood would be an interesting place. It was one of these towns that had two worlds on two sides of the tracks, so to speak. And how, as the film, could we capitalize it where we weren't having to build from scratch a set that had this kind of, you know, formidable and heavy history, and then to set these scenes in a situation like that that would also inform the performance. The Monte Cristo. There was something a little Baroque and all that ironwork, and the sign was so kind of fantastic. You know, the paint is chipping, but it did get dramatized. The main thing that we did was we painted the trim going around the hotel in this kind of green that I think in the end now, seeing it and seeing the way that, you know, the scenes are intercut between Mississippi and Africa that kind of echo this verdant landscape, the memory of Uganda that's running through the film, and how Jay is haunted by what was left behind. And some of it is this beauty. And I think the bayou then, you know, it's slightly romantic, but also haunting in a way. And so that becomes a place for respite, for, you know, a kind of solace with nature. And also, interestingly, that's where, like, one of the key kind of classical Eggleston pictures was made, with a white man, black man by the bayou. I grew up looking at, loving the cinema that was coming out of the 60s and 70s, the auteur cinema, the films of filmmakers like Ray and Ozu and the French filmmakers. And those films, maybe some of it has to do with the black and white. I never lose the suspension of disbelief, like, oh, I'm looking at the set that was made for the film. And I think that was sort of my modus operandi. That's why I love Satyajit Ray. He was, I was thinking, where did I get this idea that cinema, that you could just like use the gift of things that just kind of happen. And I don't remember the film, but there's a scene in a film where it's just a cutaway, but like somebody's, two men are walking down the street with a piano. And it's like, this is the stuff of life that happens. That's just such a gift if you are sensitized and receptive to it. Gary Winogrand, who was my first real principal teacher as a photographer, said, "There's nothing as mysterious as a fact clearly described." And that, I think, so kind of informed my sensibility again, how I went about the selection process of locations and then designing sets, and in some way finding a kind of a balance that would create the suspension of disbelief, that would create a kind of stage set, that would create a place where the actors could transport themselves and be in those roles as if that was who they were. And so that chemistry is something that's it's unpredictable. Sometimes it happens and sometimes it doesn't. And I think, that there are those moments where that intersection occurs, where all of the elements find some kind of synergy together and are working well together. That's the beauty of cinema, and that's what takes strong direction on Mira's part, and trusting the various creative contributors. Ed was a cinematographer-director. I mean, he had a strong sense of things, and he was a good listener. I think he was a great collaborator, a really good listener in his ways of working with Mira, but to where he was, and was not burdened by, formula or preconceptions. He just approached the situation, kind of freshly, and was passionate. He loves what he does. It's not a job for him. That's how I felt, and I'm sure that's how Mira felt. We were all very invested in the project. So we went to Africa together. It was all new to me. It was new to Ed. And so I think that was, an opportunity for us to really kind of hang and just appreciate that world that was so other, I think, in Africa. I picked the locations, but there was less work to do in a certain way. And yet to hold on to some of where we're from and to not repudiate it and to understand it as we are part of something larger. There were certain things even to do with signage. Like there was driving out of New Orleans, there was like a road restaurant called White Kitchen. Now, you can read this any which way you want, but I read it the way that I read it, and it just to me was striking out in the middle of this bayou landscape to see this sign, and I'm not even sure the restaurant was still functioning. But we actually took that sign and I put it in the landscape where the scenes are in the rain in the telephone booth. It was a more interesting time, I think, as well, where you just didn't, still even late 80s, early 90s, the regionalism was a little bit more distinct, not as homogenized. You still had more of these independent motels. There's a rawness because it's just on the verge of happening. These people are just, this immigrant wave are moving into this sort of opportunity, this business opportunity, and it's just at the beginning. And I think that's what's so interesting. It's sort of finding its place. I think certain Indian community, maybe Gujaratis, they're just itinerant. They're willing to sort of, for commercial opportunities, put themselves out there. I got a commission, maybe it was for Fortune or some magazine, to photograph an Indian motel or hotel motel convention in Atlanta. This was maybe years after we did Masala, and it was so interesting because it was the whole thing was it was all Indians. And what's interesting now is I think a lot of the these hotel chains, the Hampton Inns and the Comfort Inns, and these are all Indian owned. The assimilation had been fully realized. There's a picture with, I think it's called the Stonewall Jackson, 100% American owned and operated. And that was going on then. There were those that were seeking out motels where you didn't have Indians running them. That was another form of racism that was playing out.
You wouldn't believe all the racket they're making. It's 10 o'clock and my customers are complaining, so you better come right on over.
Send them back to the reservation, that's what I'll say.
How many times do I have to tell you? They're not that kind of Indian.
I think that was brave of Mira to get at that and somehow in this way. In being partnered with Mira and then married to her as an American white man, I was, we were the subject of racial discrimination. It was uncomfortable. I think being in India, period, made me understand a lot of things about America that I would never have had a distance on. So I think that gave me just a greater sensitivity. It might have been my most meaningful, life-altering experience. I think Mira is really got this tremendous feeling for her world as an Indian, and has had this worldly experience that's taken her out of that. But in an emotive way, I think that's what she knows best and has something to say about. And I think that the whole idea for her of racism as in India was deeply troubling, and that's why I think she gravitated toward this story.
Look, I'm a black man born and raised in Mississippi. Ain't a damn thing you can tell me about struggle.
What do you know about my...
No, I know. I know you and your folks can come down here from God knows where and be about as black as the ace of spades, and as soon as you get here, you start acting white.
It was something that she wanted to wrestle with narratively and also humanly. And I think that she has the gift of detachment, of having studied, abroad and then having carved out a path for herself as a filmmaker that made it possible for her to go back to India and to look at subjects that were taboo, that were controversial, like with Cabaret or Masala in Bombay.
Uganda is our home and we are going to stay here.
And Masala, in some way, I think furthers that, and also here takes her connection to America and to all that symbolizes for her personally, but also for her community, and to extend it, with a narrative that's touching on the theme of racism in a way that could be, very, very bald.